All right, folks. Uh, Thanks again for joining me here. This is True News 16, and this time I want to talk about this suicide situation that's going on. I mean, there's suicides. The rates in general are up. Our police officers are committing suicide. Our teens are committing suicide. Our pastors are committing suicide. There has been more than enough news of police killing themselves lately, and also pastors. Okay, we know that we're living in perilous times, right? And days that many would say they are the last days. I would say we're living in the last days, okay? But then we've always had our waves of tough times generationally. There were many times that we've had really bleak times in history. During times of the plague, you can only imagine people losing loved ones and people dying early, and the suffering that that has caused. During the times of the Depression, 1929, could imagine people, lots of suicides going on. People lost their money and their living and their ways of feeding their families. There are times, different times and times in history where people have, suicide rates have gone up for various reasons. This time, it's pretty much the same. During perilous times, during times of confusion, of uncertainty and hopelessness and stuff like that. There's also a lot of confusion as to what's going on here. Okay, now if we center and we just speak directly to what's going on, we also know that there is, our society, the way it handles mental illness is has changed over the last 30, 40 years. People are no longer staying in hospitals, being institutionalized. Mental health hospitals have changed their practices. Their diagnosing has changed. There are many different things going on in society. Plus, the contention that we have politically has also contributed to a lot of confusion, anxieties, and stuff like that. Also, the proliferation of drugs. There's so much in society. So the whole idea as to why there's so many suicide really you should rest at ease that there are answers, at least to understand. And it's pretty obvious why there's so much going on. There's also a lot of godlessness. And when I say godlessness, I mean people with various coping strategies, mechanisms, different religions, different ways that they cope. And so various people are going to cope in different ways, and they have their, if I should say, their crutches are different, and their coping strategies are different across the board. I know personally of someone who is always, whenever their financial situation comes around, the person starts to become suicidal. Okay, and that's when a person becomes very desperate. They have no idea of the uncertainty that they have to live under is so nerve-wracking and anxiety provoking that people just don't know what to do with themselves. And then it's just an incredible thing that we're seeing now. Recently, a pastor, for a Calvary Chapel pastor, has killed himself, and people are asking now. The question once again arises in the Christian community: what exactly is going on? Now, you've got one camp saying, well, this Calvary Chapel organization is really not Christian, and their gospel is very worldly, and they really are prone to using worldly attractions to get people to come and come crusades and things like that. And there is lots and lots of validity to that, because what happens is that it offers a false hope. But in general, there are people that come to, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because my blog is primarily a Christian worldview commentary. And so I would speak on this and say that it is true that people come in various ways having a different understanding of theology, will have along the way have different coping strategies and mechanisms and before them in order to help them. And what a person believes has a lot to do with who the person is and who the person becomes. So it's very important that people understand that there are no superficial understandings of these things. Now, God does not come into a person's life to make their life better or to live that best life now, which has been highly criticized with good reason. And if people come under that under that mentality, when those winds blow, okay, and that earth shakes, it's gonna shake not only you, but it's also gonna shake your faith. And so it's very important that people understand where they stand in terms of, the Bible, and in terms of God and your relationship and what salvation actually is. Now, this is incredibly debatable, and the more I think about it, the more it complicated the conversation is in terms of suicide, whether it's a sin and whether it's forgivable and what's going on with a person. Now, I have a personal testimony that someone very close to me that I adore and love committed suicide, and I know that this person really loved the Lord. Okay, this person, their theology wasn't okay. This person wasn't a trained seminary student, or even a person who was professionally or educationally trained in the scriptures. But that, in many cases, is not needed for a person to have a close walk with the Lord. These things are very varied, and the thief on the cross went to paradise, and he didn't have a seminary degree. Okay, so it depends on the person and depends on how and who the Lord touches. Okay, so I would not dare to say that a person who's not well versed in theology does not have a good command or stand in their walk with Christ. But I will say that just by his fruit, I knew, because I lived with the person, and I knew and I could hear the person's agony and prayer, because they did suffer from mental illness, and they had paranoia. They was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Now, we know that paranoid schizophrenics, they suffer paranoias and delusions, and this is part to having to do with organic or genetic or chemical imbalances in their brain. Just like your liver can be ill, so can your brain. Your brain is also an organ, and so we understand, at least in part, that the brain can, through injury or through organic situations or developmental or can have problems and can be ill and diseased. So this person did end up committing suicide, but we knew that this person was delusional. Whether they did it in a delusional state, we don't know. Now, we also know that depression, certain aspects of depression, can bring forth a certain paranoia and also certain delusions as well that can overtake a person. Like, let's say, for instance, now that we are in 9/11, today is 9/11, and when you consider, just for the sake of conversation, the people that were up in the towers okay, many, many floors up. Now, those people, let's say, for instance, if you were afraid of heights, would you stand up on top on the ledge of the 105th floor in the World Trade Center? Would you do that for kicks? The average person wouldn't. But if the inside of your office or the inside of the building was 400 degrees, okay, and the flames were approaching you, you may actually do something like that, okay? And the jumping out part might have been a level of desperation that we right now, even in this conversation, cannot even fathom. Okay, just to exercise our brains on this. So an extreme situation can push you to an extreme action. Okay, and of course, bottom line of all of this, at the end of the story, at the end of the day, God truly is the judge as to exactly what happens, who happens, how it happens, where, why, and when. Okay, God is the one that truly knows. We are only spectators, and even with that, we have extremely limited information as to what's going on in a person's heart and mind. Okay, so a person may react in a certain way. Like, for instance, I've always said, like, when I was a kid, my family, we were involved in a fire, and there was a fire above the building, the floor above where we lived, and all I hear was screaming. One early morning, I look up and I see flames coming out and smoke coming out of the floor above me. I immediately rush, and the panic is set on, and without, we, thank God, we all got out okay and no one perished. But when you say, okay, well, what would happen if you was to have your house on fire? What would you do? Well, I grab the dog, I do this, I do a backflip, and I go out the door, before I do that, go in my closet, grab my coat, boom, boom, boom. You can say that you're going to do one thing. What you end up doing in an emergency, in a heart pumping situation like that, you never really know, right? So let's be honest, okay? If, let's say, someone had told you, well, what if you came home and there was a thief in your room, stealing your favorite CDs, okay? You would say, well, I'd get them in a headlock, and I do flip them this way, and I run that way. I'd run to the left where I have my nunchucks, and I do this to him, hit him there, and hit him there, and here, and here. I mean, you can say what you think you're going to do. What actually happens is a whole different story. So we kind of have to be, check ourselves and kind of be humble as to the reality of things in that sense. Well, to make a long story short, what happens to these people at the time, we have to be respectful and understand that who knows what these people are happening. Apparently this pastor that passed away left behind 2 sons, a wife, and he suffered from mental illness, or I think they mentioned depression for many years, and he struggled with this. Okay, so the question is that still needs to be asked: what was the source of his depression? Was it an organic problem in his brain? Was it a secretion, lack of secretion in his brain? Was it a problem of inner physical or chemical issue in his person, in his personal life? What exactly happened? God is the judge. Okay, God is the judge. Okay, now not everybody is killing themselves because of a mental illness or a psychosis. You also have other people that have derived in their circumstances by way of actions and reaping and sowing and sin. Okay, so again, God is the judge. God is the judge. I will say, though, that God will hold us responsible for all the things that we do. Whenever the Bible does talk about suicide, it speaks about it by using examples, negative examples, and it's frowned upon all the time. There's never a case, maybe one, you can make an argument with Samson, how Samson decided to break the the pillars in one final act of revenge and suicide in order to kill his enemies, which is something that he was raised for, to destroy the Philistines. And the Lord had anointed him to be able to protect his people for that purpose. And perhaps that was part of that anointing for him. And it so happened to be a suicide at the same time. So we don't exactly know, and rather it can be debatable. It can be debated. But everywhere else in the scriptures, to my knowledge, suicide is frowned upon. So suicide, I do believe, is a sin. But then you also have the concept of once saved, always saved, or rather, the preservation of the saints. If we feel that, like for instance, the martyrs all went to, there are many martyrs that went to their death singing hymns and singing to the Lord and praising the Lord. And so you have others that would not deny Christ no matter what torture they endured. So you can have to look at these things, examples, on one side and each side, and make your decision and continue pondering these things. But I believe that that God knows the heart of the person who commits these things. And we can't rightly say that, God will forgive, because we don't know what their personal struggles were or their walk was with the Lord, in all honesty. I also believe that not everybody is suffering psychosis to the point where they, don't know what they're doing. They're in a phase that they are outside of their intellectual capacity, or in a diminished capacity mentally. Okay, so we really don't. Not everyone goes through that. Then you have other people that are just selfish and they want to, leave, just check out, like they say, right? And, end it. Okay. Whereas they really don't actually believe that, that God will see them through these things. Okay. And then you have other people don't have the understanding that it is through persevering and abiding and maintaining. And the Bible speaks a whole lot about us standing and holding fast and enduring hardness as men. There's a lot of language on there that's not defeative or giving up language. It's about dealing with these things, and in a culture that is spoiled and rich and has known and entitled. It also is a bad argument for someone who is killing themselves and also leaving behind children. We know that suicide, people of families of suicide, the chances of suicide increase exponentially, because now their sense of strength is now diminished in terms of persevering to the end. My father did that. Like they'll say, I saw this happen with my uncle, and my aunt did it too. And the chances that this person is now going to also release and give up early is a lot greater now. Okay. So that in itself is an incredible judgment and sin. So I personally am not of the vein, that believes that sin is forgiven, or that perhaps, if you're saved and God chose you as an elect, which would probably be a Calvinistic viewpoint. If the person is killing themselves and they're not persevering, then perhaps they're not an elect. I would say that they're not, especially because of the sin that comes from it. We see the men of God are people who spend their cares of the world are not of this world, but of the things of God. So a person who, I know for myself in a personal testimony is that when my depressions and anxieties are multiplied, when the cares of this world are what are facing me more than usual, it becomes harder to settle yourself, and you're anxious and you're or depressed or whatever, is when you focus too much on this world, when you focus on the things of God and you really start believing in the promises of God, you have joy even within hardship, even within tribulations, even within persecutions. So that's something that we see. So in other words, the language of the scriptures actually shows the opposite, okay, of giving up, of being in a spirit of giving up, of giving them a spirit of winding down your defenses. You know, if anything, it says we are more than conquerors in Christ Jesus. So there's a lot more in the scriptures that speak of suicide as sin, as patheticness, as checking out, as what do you say? Kind of, the Apostle Paul calls it. There's a word he uses. You kind of cancel yourself out or something. I forgot the word that was used, but you kind of rather disqualify, that you're disqualified or disqualify yourself by not persevering. You see, so and in all of the examples that we have of the prophets and the disciples, they're not of anyone who's given up. As much as they struggle with their own proclivities, as much as they struggle with the persecution, none of that example is laid out for us to see someone who we should look to, someone who eventually just gave up. It was always the pathetic ones, the evil ones that were driven to kill themselves. There were even the people or that were in sin that drove themselves to that demise, which is a negative, dark, and frowned upon thought. So anyway, that's what I really wanted to talk about. I may do a part 2 to this topic, and I really wanted to say, but I do believe we need to pray more. We need to pray for our families. We also need to speak to our young ones, and we need to talk about perseverance and get their eyes, get them accustomed to looking at Christ, looking at the big picture, the big reward, as opposed to getting them conditioned, which is what the world does, gets them conditioned to look to the world to find their answers and their satisfactions. This is what it's all about, and I think that this is what the faith, what the Christian faith is all about, which is the family, the walk, and the way of the Lord. That we need to know. We can't judge this individual by what they did or who they were. God really does that. Of course, there are fruit that piles up, in a person's life. But, the fact is that, honestly, we really cannot condemn someone. Only God condemns, and only God gives the ultimate judge. But we ourselves have to, when we talk about these things, we talk about the learning to persevere in the Lord, and also to have faith, and speak on and try to isolate the argument from sin to mental illness. And when we do that, we understand that there's a complete distinction between sin in the camp and disease in the camp. Those are two different things, and they are both legitimate arguments, and so they both have to be addressed, especially when we don't have the complete details. Okay, so hope you enjoyed this podcast. Until next time, this is True News 16. Talk to you soon.